A pioneer in public finance since 1955, Ellers helps clients build outstanding places to live, work, learn, and play by delivering focused, fully integrated financial advisory services. We work with more than 1,500 local governments, schools, development authorities, and public agencies, placing their needs and best interests at the heart of everything we do. We help our clients navigate all facets of public finance, including financial management planning, economic development and redevelopment, debt issuance and management, investments and treasury management, and arbitrage consulting. At Ellers, we believe strong communities aren't simply the result of transactions. They're the result of people. We build strong, long-lasting client relationships, collaborating with your staff to complete projects and drive new initiatives forward. Building strong, vibrant, and sustainable communities. Together, it's what we do. For more information, call us at 1-800-552-1171 or visit ellers-inc.com.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our transportation utility panel this morning. My name is John Cameron, and I'm a senior municipal advisor with Ellers. And before I introduce my guests and we really get started, I do have two quick housekeeping items to mention to help ensure that we will have an interactive experience with us this morning. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there are two icons, one for our live Q&A and one for our chat. As we move through today's presentation, if you have questions you'd like us to answer, simply open the Q&A tab, type it in, and submit it. We do have a moderator working behind the scenes for us today, and we will have a couple of breaks that we've got built in during the middle and then again at the end. So we will be taking questions as we go. You can also chat among other attendees by opening up the chat function. One thing to note, while you can submit any question anonymously, in the event we're not able to get to all questions today, we do recommend you allow us to see your information so we can reach out to you directly with answers to any questions that we may not have time for. So as we go ahead and get started, I'm going to introduce my guests who I'm thrilled to have with us this morning. We've got Jeff Mazanik, who is a senior consultant with R.A. Smith. Jeff is our technical engineering nerd this morning. Both Jeff and I have been in the trenches with each other over the last year, doing a fair amount of work on transportation utilities. So I'm really thrilled to have Jeff here this morning. And then Lori Kubza, who is an attorney with Boardman Clark. Also thrilled to have Lori with us. Lori's also been working with both Jeff and I on this topic over the last year. So we're thrilled to have both of them with us this morning. Transportation utilities is a relatively new concept in Wisconsin. There are a number of municipalities that are studying and exploring this topic. And as I said, both Jeff, myself, and Lori have spent the better part of the last year working on a number of different studies and really talking about this concept as it makes its way into Wisconsin. It's not totally a new concept within the United States. There are a number of transportation utilities primarily on the West Coast, but this is newer to our state. So the way we have this presentation set up this morning is really truly a panel discussion amongst the three of us, addressing a wide variety of topics that we've all dealt with while doing these studies over the last year and fielding questions from clients along the way. So I've got queued up a number of different questions that I'll go through, and we'll pass it along to myself, Jeff, or Lori, depending on the nature of the topic. So with that being said, let's get started. So first question, just from a basic standpoint, is really what is a transportation utility and how is it used? And I'm going to kind of kick this question off and then maybe field it over to Lori here for a second. But a transportation utility essentially equates a municipality's transportation network to a user charge system. where we take very similar to a water utility, sewer utility, or stormwater utility, where we really are quantifying the costs of both from a capital and an operating perspective for operating the municipality's transportation network and equating that to a user fee based on different land use categories. So that's kind of a high level overview. And really, a transportation utility would act just as a water, sewer, or stormwater utility would, meaning that it would be a separate enterprise fund within the municipality. And I know that Lori has a viewpoint that would say that that's really important. So, Lori, I'm going to let you kind of elaborate on that for a second, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, just a little bit on that. As John said, transportation utility is like a water utility or a sewer utility, and they all have their own systems. And so when you create a transportation utility, it's really important that you identify what your transportation system is. That's your enterprise, and that then your costs and costs relate to that transportation utility, that system. And rates have to be tied to that system. And so we'll be talking about that more later. But identifying what this segregated enterprise is really important to start with.
Great. Thanks, Lori. If we go to the next question. So the transportation utility, like Lori and I had said, is based on a user fee concept. So let's talk for a minute about user fees. When we talk about a water utility or sewer utility, and we talk about user fees, generally what we have is a volumetric rate per 1,000 gallons or per 100 cubic feet. When we talk about a water utility, in most cases, you have a tiered rate structure. On the sewer side, you might have rates for higher than domestic strength waste. So transportation utility really is no different in terms of developing a user charge. In this case, the user charge is based on use of the system. And we're going to spend the next several slides talking about how these user charges can be developed based on the concept of trip generation. But when we talk about a user fee, really what we're doing is first establishing the revenue requirement for the utility. So just like you would do when you go through a rate study for any of your other utilities, the first thing you need to really identify is how much revenue do we need to generate from our user charges to pay for the costs within the system. So we spend a fair amount of time identifying what those costs are. In most cases, when we talk about transportation systems and transportation network, transportation utilities can be very heavily capital focused. In fact, in some places, they can be 100% capital focused in that we're really recovering the costs for street reconstruction, either on a cash funded basis or debt funded basis, where the user charges could be used to generate revenue to help pay the debt service related to specific transportation utility projects. But the first step in this process is really identifying how much revenue do we need to generate within our utility. The second step in that is determining our denominator. And for that, we usually are relying on the concept of trip generation in terms of use of the system. And that's really important because that generates that rational nexus between the property, a particular property owner's use of the system and how much they would then pay through user rates. Once we develop the number of trips in our system, we're simply dividing our cost by our number of trips to get to our user rates, and then parsing them back out into rates established for residential and non-residential categories. So that's kind of an overview of how user rates work. I don't know, Jeff, if you had any thing to add on that? If not, I'll be happy to kind of go on to the next slide here.
Well, there'll be more detail later, but one thing, John, that I really like that you started with, and I think that resonates well for people, is the correlation to the water utility. And, when you have water service to a property, you have the ability to get water by opening a faucet, turning a faucet. And then you have the option to use more water or less water, different quantities, and it's metered. Here, the correlation is that when you have street infrastructure serving your property, it gives you the benefit of access, being able to leave your property and come back to it and go out to the whole wide world. And then the amount that you use it correlates to a volume of water. So the trips that John mentioned as generated for each property are the variable, and that's what determines the cost.
Mm-hmm. No, you're exactly right, Jeff, and that is a really good point when we talk about user charges and how we're going about calculating them. Sticking with that kind of line, Jeff, if we go on to the next slide here, as we talk about, establishing our revenue requirement and looking at how much revenue are we going to generate through the utility, one of the key initial concepts is defining what is our transportation system. So for that, Jeff, I'm going to turn to you to talk about, when we talk about transportation system and network, what are we talking about for a municipality?
Yeah, I think what we're really addressing here are all those components of the street right-of-way, those parts of the system that allow you to move vehicles back and forth and to keep them controlled. We talk about curbs and gutters and sidewalks as parts of that system to protect pedestrians from vehicles. That whole infrastructure, as it works together and connects everything together.
One question kind of along this line that's come up in different studies is, what about your curb and gutter system? Is that, considered part of the transportation network generally?
Curb and gutter is interesting because a lot of communities across the state recognize that curbs and gutters are part of both the street system. They define the sides of the street and they keep the vehicles aligned more on them. But it's also a big part of our stormwater management too. When we design stormwater management facilities and plans, we rely on the curb and gutter to convey water to drainage structures, inlets, and we also use it as a way to provide some storage on the streets. So while there's certainly a lot of value in curb and gutter for transportation, there's also for stormwater management, and both apply.
Sure.
Hey,
So
John,
go ahead, Lori.
I just want to add something. It is really important that if a community is looking at establishing a transportation utility, that it give a lot of thought to how it defines its transportation system. And actually, then I would suggest that its definition, whatever that's going to include, is reflected in its ordinance, because as we talk about later on, the costs and the rates that are established need to tie back to the use of that transportation system. So it's really important to give thought to how you're going to define the transportation system and what's all going to be included in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's also very important, particularly as you start to work on the ordinance for implementation in terms of defining what is your transportation system. So thanks, Lori. If we go to the kind of the next question here, so staying kind of in the same line of thinking, so we talk about first, what is our transportation system and how do we define it? The other part of the equation, as I said, when we establish user charges, is establishing kind of our denominator in terms of when we have our cost, what are we dividing our use by? So we've talked about this concept of trip generation, and you'll see on this slide the old-fashioned trip generation manuals, which I understand now are completely online. But for those who suffer from insomnia, you can certainly pick up a copy of this, read through it. It'll put you right to sleep. But people like Jeff deal in this world all the time. And really that's, when we talk about trip generation and measuring number of trips by parcel, this is really Jeff's wheelhouse, and I've greatly appreciated working with him on a number of different studies over the last year and learning more about this concept. But to start just very basic, Jeff, can you just kind of walk through what is a trip? What are we really talking about when we say trip generation?
That's a good question, John. Thanks. A trip is defined in the trip generation statistics as the movement from or to a property. So when you left home this morning to go to work, presuming that didn't mean just walking downstairs to your basement office, that was one trip. And while you're away, if the garbage collection comes and picks up your trash for the week, that's a second trip. And when they leave, it's a third. And when you return home, it's a fourth. So it's the movement onto or away from your property as a single trip.
Okay. Jeff, maybe you could spend just a few minutes talking about how trip generation works for different land use categories, residential versus non-residential.
Sure. Thanks, John. The manuals John referenced there in the green manuals in the picture, those are produced by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and they've been developing them and adding to them and revising them for several decades now. And traffic engineers for many of your communities that have designed intersections and signalization systems have relied on them for a very long time to come up with estimated traffic counts and get an idea of how heavy traffic will be at a point. A lot of times they're using statistics on peak hour, peak flow, peak morning. We're looking at the data here and pulling from it their average weekday statistics. So we're using data on each type of property that's listed there, and there's about 250 of them, different land use types, the number of trips generated on an average weekday. And here's the key to John's question, per unit. And the units vary depending on the type of property. So, for example, a residential property, a single family home, is considered a single dwelling unit. So there are statistics for trips generated by that single family home. Similarly, if you have an apartment in a 3 to 10 story building, each of those is a dwelling unit as well, and each of those has a certain number of trips. By comparison, the number of trips generated at a single family home is about 9.4. For an apartment unit in a high rise like that, it's somewhat less in the 6 or 7 trip per average weekday range. Going to the non-residential properties, then many times the billable unit is based on an area measurement, or it could be acres of land. For example, a fast food restaurant with a drive-through window, which we see many of, is rated at something about 470 trips per 1,000 square feet per average weekday. So in a case like that, you're using that specific rate of trips per unit, being thousands of square feet, times the size of the building to come up with an assigned number of trips. And the same for each different type of property with a measurable base unit.
Thanks, Jeff. Before we leave this question, one other thing I wouldn't mind you touching on, for those who are thinking about a transportation utility, you might be listening to this and thinking this seems like a lot of work to put together the parcel database. When you start thinking about the number of parcels in your municipality. So maybe just before we move on to the next question, which deals a little bit more on the single family side, maybe you could talk about just your experience in terms of working with municipalities and developing the model for the number of trips.
Certainly. Thank you. The first time I had the opportunity to work on this was in about 2003, and it's remarkable how much better the data available to us today is. And right now, the ability to assign trips on every parcel in the community is easier when we have more definitive data in terms of land use types. A lot of times our databases now even include business names, and assessors data often includes structural sizes, finished areas and buildings and all. A lot of communities also have very good information on the number of dwelling units and multifamilies. To the degree that all that data is readily available, assigning trips is pretty easy. Looking at a couple of communities we've worked in with about 24 or 25,000 parcels, 17 to 18,000 of those in each of those communities were single-family homes, which can be assigned immediately because they're all the same. And another 3,000 or 4,000 were multifamily properties, and again, are pretty much formula driven. So when you break it down, you end up with a handful of properties, as you'd expect looking at your own communities. That could be pretty complicated. And then it's a matter of breaking down each part of the property and its function and its size. So it sounds very intimidating, but it's probably not as bad as you'd expect. We correlated, I think, pretty well to the effort it takes to develop and then maintain a stormwater utility. Again, very similar where you're looking at each of those non-residential properties to some degree.
Thanks, Jeff. Kind of staying with that line of thought, if we go on to the next question, from a residential side, so with a transportation utility, very similar, like Jeff said, to a stormwater utility, where all single-family parcels pay the same rate. And I think one of the questions that we've gotten along the way is, why is that? Why do we have all single-family parcels pay the same rate? Particularly if I don't own a vehicle, and my next door neighbor has 3 teenagers at home, and they've got cars all over their driveway. So maybe, Jeff, you could spend a few minutes talking about that.
Yeah, I'd love to, and then I'd like to toss a lifeline to Lori for part of that as well. But from the first part of it, the amount of trips that are generated, again, aren't entirely limited to the ones that the occupants of the property generate. So while you may have somebody who lives alone and doesn't have those teenage children like many of us have had over the years, they're still generating trips themselves. But in addition, there's the DoorDash deliveries, and as we said earlier, the mail deliveries, the Amazon parcels with increasing frequency, it seems, on that. So truly there is a difference between, my residence when I had 2 teenage kids at home and it seemed their friends were always visiting, and if you're retired and empty nesters and have less like that. But the other part of that is that you need to be able to apply these in an administrative fashion that's functional and can be effectively done and economical. And I think really that's maybe where we toss this to Lori.
Yeah. One of the things with any types of fees is that there needs to be a reasonable relationship between the use and the fee. And it doesn't have to be a precise relationship. It doesn't have to be exact. You can have reasonable approximations. And that's really what we see with other utilities. With wastewater utilities, you use a water meter to approximate how much wastewater, how much usage of the wastewater system there is. With stormwater utilities, you use impervious area to approximate how much use there is of the stormwater system. And that's really what the TRIP method is for transportation utilities. It's an approximation, a good approximation, but an approximation of the amount of usage of that transportation system.
Lori, kind of staying along that same line of thinking, one of the thinking about transportation utilities similar to a water utility or sewer utility, I think of the American Water Works Association as kind of one of the leading voices in terms of establishment of user rates. And one of the principles they have in terms of rate development is ease of administration. So when you think about treating a class the same, I would think that also kind of factors into this, correct?
I would agree that would factor in. I think we need to be maybe a little bit more careful when we're dealing with a brand new type of utility, like a transportation utility, than you would have to be with a well-established form of utility like the water or wastewater, because you're going to always be there's going to be suggestions that the usage is more like a tax, and so that so I just think we need to be more careful and not rely quite so much on administrative convenience in just allocating one to a residential parcel. But I do think administrative convenience is important, but not as determinative with transportation utilities.
Sure. The other analogy that I'm thinking of, might apply more on the sewer side in particular, but water certainly too, is, you could have the example where I have a home that is, say, right next to the wastewater treatment facility versus Jeff, who may live on the opposite end of town, and the amount of infrastructure that it takes to get to Jeff, or that Jeff's waste takes to the wastewater treatment facility versus mine. And even though we are different in terms of our geographic area and proximity to the plant, we're still being treated the same in that we're paying the same volumetric rate per 1,000 gallons. Is that kind of a fair analogy?
Yeah, I would say that's a very good analogy. Again, it's a reasonable. It's cost averaging is the term that's often used in utility rate making within a class, and that's really what the transportation utility is doing with regard to their residential class.
Okay,
John, I'd like to add one more component to this too, is that of the number of communities we're working with, the typical cost for an average single family home in a year has ranged from about $50 to about $150. So if you were to differentiate those trips within that, the amount of money you're talking about as a differential is not real huge, at least not on a monthly billing basis.
sure. Well, I think that's also a very good point when we talk about this concept as well. So before we leave kind of the trip generation, we'll make sure to kind of beat this horse as much as we can here and kind of go on to the next question. I think the final thing here, and I think we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but when we talk about trip generation, I think the biggest question is why, when we think about how transportation utilities could be charged, why is trip generation, possibly seen as the most superior way to look at it, or maybe that's not a fair statement, maybe the most defensible method for looking at it. And I would simply say it gives a good approximation between a property owner's use of the system and how much they would pay. And I think maybe, before we leave that, I would kind of toss it out to either Lori or Jeff to maybe get your thoughts on that if you have any.
Well, I would follow up on what you said, and I think it's the closest correlation to the benefit a property receives and the impact that the trips that it generates have on the road infrastructure. So it's the closest to being able to. I mean, obviously, we can't do a water meter equivalent on every property. Right. I think it's the most accurate representation, as you noted.
Because go ahead, Lori. Go ahead.
Well, I would just agree with that, because especially when you're creating a new utility, it is important to have the best way you can, or a strong basis for how you're allocating fees based on usage. So trips is really an excellent way to identify what the usage is of this transportation system that you're now creating as a separate enterprise.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that we've gotten here in this concept is, what about just having, why trip generation? Why not just have a big fixed charge? Everybody pays, a fixed charge per parcel, and we just do it that way. What's, maybe Lori, you could talk about why that might be problematic.
Well, I mean, again, there is a statute out there that says that fees have to bear a reasonable relationship to the service for which the fee is imposed. And that's true for any fee, but it's particularly true for a utility-based fee. And to just have a flat charge that would apply the same charge to everyone, it would be hard to see how that establishes a reasonable relationship to the service for which the fees imposed.
Okay. at this point, I think we're going to take some Q&A, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to read them here and parse them out to Jeff and Lori. No, I'll help too. So the first question is regarding the revenue requirement. Can we reduce the revenue requirement by splitting costs with the levy? Can you have a transportation utility that doesn't rely solely on user fees? For example, 50% utility, 50% taxes. Can we also discuss where communities we have worked with that have been contemplating this split for the revenue requirement? And I can start with this question, and then Jeff and Lori, if you want to jump in, that would be great. I think the short answer is yes. Again, when we're establishing our revenue requirement, it's important to note where our sources of funding are coming in from, so that we're not double counting. But certainly, you can have part of the transportation utility remain on the tax levy, and a portion be funded through user charges. In fact, one of the communities that we did work with wanted us to look at a number of different scenarios, ranging from 100% user charge funded, cash funding of street reconstruction projects, down to a scenario where 50% of the costs that weren't picked up by, they had a wheel tax in this situation, transportation aids, part of their costs were funded through the stormwater utility. So the remaining cost would be split, with 50% being funded through the property tax levy, and then the remaining 50% being funded through the transportation utility. So that's certainly a possibility. And I think another example of that would be, like I said, with curb and gutter. If you do have a stormwater utility, where you look at and make sure that your stormwater related costs are segregated within that utility, and transportation utility is funding its proportionate share. So I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, either one of you.
I would add just that it is important, though, that if you're creating the utility, that you have this, again, segregation, and that within this segregated enterprise, you can obtain revenue from general property taxes, but you should acknowledge that's how it's working, because one of the differences between a utility and a tax is the use, whether it's used for general revenue or general expenses. And you want to make it clear that the transportation utility is a segregated fund, and that you're using this general purpose revenue for the segregated fund.
Great. The second question we got is, are transportation utilities feasible in smaller communities? Are all users charged fees, or mainly larger businesses and industrial users? How does the utility charge for businesses that are not part of the local community, like UPS or FedEx? So maybe we could kind of break this down here. So I guess question one, are transportation utilities feasible in smaller communities? And the answer is definitely yes. In fact, I'd say, a number of communities that have been looking at this to date have been smaller municipalities. And I think, when you think about transportation utilities, and we're going to talk a little bit about this when we get to a slide talking about operating expenses and levy limits, we're roughly 15 years into levy limits. And, when we talk about transportation costs on the capital side, I think, most communities fund their road costs the same way, and that they debt finance them. So when we talk about, smaller municipalities in particular, every municipality is restricted in terms of how much general obligation borrowing capacity they have. Those transportation dollars, road projects, are competing with other projects for bonding dollars. So when you talk about smaller communities, I could almost make an argument that smaller municipalities, this would be more applicable just purely from a funding side. But I think the other side of the coin is the distribution of land use categories. So when we talked about, trip generation, one of the cool pie charts that Jeff has when we go through these studies is we look at kind of that distribution of equalized value amongst the municipality, which is going to trend in most municipalities, some more than others, is going to trend very heavy residential. And we look at that, the fact that, the residential property class under the property tax method, for the most part carries the water when it talks about funding, levy projects. When we switch that and look at trip generation and a user charge method, that distribution of costs generally shifts to the non-resident, from residential to non-residential to a certain extent. Certainly residential still pays its fair share, but we do see that distribution shift. So, Jeff, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing. The first city to do this was Tualatin, Oregon, about 30 years ago. And it's one of the smaller cities in Oregon. And of the 30 or so cities in that state that continue to use these, many of them are smaller sized communities on that. So as John was describing, it's very much a good tool, even for smaller communities.
Mm-hmm. The other piece of this for the large users, we've got a slide that we'll talk about when we get to the large user section. So I'm going to kind of hold that thought here for a second. The other thing I'll mention before we move on is we're going to have two other opportunities for Q&A. So keep your questions coming. We do appreciate them, and we'll do our best to try to get through everybody here. Moving on to the next page, in terms of legal authority, Lori, if you could spend just a few minutes talking about, what is kind of our legal authority here when we talk about establishing a transportation utility.
When I look at this, I really see two strong grounds for legal authority for the municipalities to do this. And one, and this has been talked about before, but in other opinions, is the municipal home rule. Municipalities have the authority in the statute and in the Constitution to take action for the health, safety, and welfare of the public, to carry out their powers by any necessary or convenient means, and that power is supposed to be defined broadly. And I think that's a very, very strong basis for a municipality to establish a transportation utility. But another grounds that really hasn't been talked about all that much is Wisconsin statute section 66.0621, which is the statute that authorizes municipalities to issue revenue bonds. And that statute has within it a definition of public utility. And the definition there is very broad, and it refers to any revenue producing facility or enterprise owned by a municipality and operated for a public purpose. And that statute then defines a lot of different things that can be public utilities, and it goes much, much broader than just water or wastewater or stormwater utilities. It refers to things like parks, courthouses, child care centers, and it also includes, and it's a very broad category or a very broad list of things. And then it includes the catch-all phrase, and any other necessary public work projects undertaken by a municipality. And based upon that, it seems that, in my view, that municipalities would have the authority under that statute to develop a transportation utility. That not only acknowledges it, but it really gives explicit authority to develop a transportation utility.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, but when you talk about, when stormwater utilities first kind of came on the scene, this is kind of the same authority that they were operating under in terms of justifying their creation prior to, specific legislation being written for them, correct?
Well, generally, I think the stormwater utilities also piggybacked on the wastewater utility statute, the explicit authority there. But I don't think transportation utilities can rely on that authority in the water or wastewater utility world. But I do believe this statute is broad enough to cover the development of a transportation utility.
Okay, thanks. If we move on to the next slide and we see a scene that I think we'd all wish we were there for, beach, with the exception of the birds. And we talk about adjustments for different land uses. You know, one of the questions that we get when we go through these types of studies is, you know, we talk about a potential credit or credit policy. Two examples that we've had kind of come up is from a residential side, what about our snowbirds, those who, you know, really are kind of leaving town for a significant portion of the winter, coming back in spring or summer, you know, any sort of credit or exemption for them. And, you know, for that, I'm going to kind of open it up to both Jeff and Lori, but maybe Jeff, you could talk a little bit about, you know, that concept.
Yeah, a couple of things there. Yeah, thanks, John. And actually, I'd like to circle back to, there was another part to the question from the audience before that was asking about properties like UPSs and others that aren't owned by people who live in the community. I think we probably need to emphasize that this utility applies to every property in the community that has any development of any sort on it, regardless of whether it's taxed or not, regardless of who owns it. So it's just like everybody pays a water bill. In the same way, even properties owned by the municipality itself will end up having trips assigned and pay a fee, a user charge for trip generation for the transportation utility, in the same way that City Hall pays a water bill to the water utility on it. So switching a bit from being totally the technical nerd on it to a little bit of reality, we can calculate these numbers, but you look at Wisconsin, where we're all sitting today, you know, you can't operate a golf course year round. So you have to accommodate that. You have to make adjustments on that based on those kind of seasonal or even climate type of impacts, because the model and the number of trips assigned per property are intended to, as best they can, reflect, you know, reality. So seasonal changes obviously aren't something that the owner can affect. They're something they have to live with. The snowbird concept that John addressed is an interesting one, and I'm sure Lori will have input on this from a practical administrative perspective. A couple of the communities we've worked with already have provisions in their water utility billing process where people who are actually leaving town for 3 or 4 months formally and officially notify them of that, or even in some cases, I guess, pull their meters. So you have those kinds of opportunities to consider in setting a policy where you may not charge a trip charge for that period of time when someone's away. The other item that John has on the slide here is highway access on it, and that correlates to, in some communities where the cost for building and maintaining roadways is shared with other levels of government, there's an opportunity to recognize that as well on that. And finally, there are other properties that objectively and certainly aren't used fully all year, like K-12 schools, that you need to correct that adjustment again to best reflect real trip generation.
You know, one thing I'm thinking of with this, and there is, in my mind, there is a difference between somebody like a snowbird versus a K-12 school, or, you know, highway access only parcels. And I guess I mention that because just because somebody goes to Florida, you know, or Arizona for 3 months of the year, doesn't mean we fold up the road in front of their house and do away with it. You know, the transportation network is still there. So I think this, you know, in my mind, the snowbird concept is a bit of a slippery slope. I can see, and I know we've dealt with in other communities, the highway access only parcels where they really aren't necessarily, you know, touching, you know, local streets. but you do, in many cases, you might have a highway access only parcel that you still need to rely on the local transportation network to get there, or workers need to rely on that network to get there. So I think, maybe the takeaway here is that there are, situations where you do really need to sit down and think about what the best way to go with dealing with some of these parcels. But the snowbird concept, I think, is one that gives me a little bit of heartburn, I guess. I don't know, Lori, if you have anything to add on that. If not, we'll move on.
Well, the only thing is that whatever type of adjustments you make, you have to make across the board. And the consistency is really important. And I guess that's all I would say. Okay.
Well, kind of sticking with that same concept, the next slide talks about, what about, and this is something that we've spent a fair amount of time talking about and dealing with, as well as what about reducing that impact for your largest ratepayers? So, during the Q&A session, we talked a little bit about this in terms of when we look at the distribution on an equalized value basis, the residential property class, it's no secret across the state, for the most part, carries the water in terms of, the paying of costs for the transportation network. When we switch, and we particularly switch to a transportation network, you can have some very large charges for your largest customers. You think about, say the Quick Trips of the world, or those properties that really generate a fair amount of traffic, that depending on your revenue requirement, some of those charges can be fairly substantial. The other thing to mention here, when you start to talk about the creation of that transportation utility, and you go to a scenario where we're going to fund 100% of our transportation costs through the utility, and we see larger revenue requirements, that in particular is a situation mathematically where we do get some bigger charges for our largest property owners. So, one thing that has come up is, well, what if we just artificially reduce the number of trips? We just cap it for a non-residential parcel. So, Jeff or Lori, depending on, I don't know who wants to start here, but maybe we could talk a little bit about a cap, an artificial cap for our largest ratepayers.
Maybe if I start with the nerdy part and we move to the more fun part. But from a practical perspective, the way I view this is when you're looking at any individual property, your goal is to, as accurately as possible, assign trips based on how that property is used and its effective size on it. And I think when you're looking at things like that, we all recognize the equity of having it based on the total number of trips, but it's just like large water users. It's surprising. It can be pretty costly for it. So I think that's kind of the reality of it, and why it's important to do a good model up front and know what the range of what you're dealing with that. Lori?
Well, I would just go back to the statute that says you've got to have a reasonable relationship to the fees for which, or to the service for which the fee is charged. And if you just artificially, if you say I'm going to do it on trips and then you artificially cap trips, are you really carrying out that requirement, that statutory requirement? And I think especially when you're dealing with a new type of utility, it's important to be careful and not make arbitrary caps or credits or things like that, because then you will be accused of just seeking to change, to reallocate the property tax. I think if you're looking to make adjustments, you're better off doing what the earlier question suggested is, continuing to fund a portion of the utility with property tax, and then a portion of the revenue with the utility fees, than you are to artificially make changes to the calculation of the fees.
One other example along with this that we didn't talk as much about yet is when we talk about user charges and maybe user rate design, when you think about a water utility and a sewer utility, in a lot of cases, what you have is a volumetric rate, and then you also have a fixed charge component. And for some of the studies that we've worked on to date, we've looked at the concept of a smaller fixed charge, recognizing that number one, part of our revenue requirement isn't 100% dictated by the number of trips we have coming through our system. But also there's an availability perspective that goes along with the establishment of user rates. That even if we do have like a snowbird situation and a property owner goes south for a couple months, that transportation network is still there, just like a water system or sewer system. The pipes are there, the infrastructure is still there. That has to be paid for and maintained regardless of whether the property owner is there 12 months of the year and using the system or not. So, in some cases, we've seen a fixed charge component in addition to a trip charge. When we get to where no pun intended, where the rubber meets the road, and you start to see the magnitude of the charges for some of your largest customers, that's where you can get some questions about manipulation of the charges. Well, an example would be, what if we just raise the fixed charge and reduce the trip charge as a way to alleviate the burden on our biggest customers? And from what I'm hearing, mainly from Lori, is we should really give that some pause, because we're getting away from kind of a cost of service type component and getting into something that is much more arbitrary. So I think those are all things to consider when we deal with this topic of our largest customer. So if we go to the next page then, and we talk about expenses, and then after this slide, we're going to take another Q&A break if we have any questions in the queue. So one of the questions that has come up when we deal with the revenue requirement is, in most cases, we're funding, in fact, just about, I think, every study that we've worked on here or talked with municipalities about, certainly you think about our capital costs and our street reconstruction costs as being a part of our world when we talk about what's going to be funded through the utility. But what about operating expenses? Should operating expenses be funded through the utility? And I'm going to kind of take this question in this slide here. And I think certainly when we talk about transportation utility, relative to water, sewer, operating costs are part of the revenue requirement. And if we're going to say that we're going to fund our transportation utility expenses wholly through the utility versus a property tax, that operating expenses come along with that. I think right now, when we think about operating expenses and we convert that from the tax levy to a user charge, one of the things to be aware of going forward is how this might play into levy limits in the future. So right now, transportation costs are not one of the covered service provisions under levy limits. That's not to say that may change in the future from a legislative standpoint. The other thing would be, to be thinking of is, again, this is a brand new concept in the state. And while a community may have some success initially putting the fee into place, if a future council or village board or town board comes in and says, we hate transportation utility, we want to do away with this, and we are going to do away with it, and decide to end it, and we have operating expenses that we now need to try to move back into the levy, that can be an area where either, number one, we're possibly having to go to referendum to bring those costs, to raise our levy and give us that levy capacity to bring that back into the levy, or number two, we're having to consider cutting services to bring those costs back in. So this is, I think, just more a futuristic thing to consider. I think what we've heard from some is, we definitely want to try to look at trading a transportation utility into place as quickly as possible under the thought that maybe we'd be grandfathered in if some future provision, gets put into place from a levy limit perspective. I think the bottom line is that all remains to be seen. But that's, from an operating expense standpoint, that's something to certainly be aware of. In terms of prohibited expenses, I think the league had done a piece this past summer, and one of the items they talked about was snow plowing expense in terms of, keeping that out of the utility and as part of the levy. The other thing I guess I would mention is really, again, making sure that your transportation utility is not double counting or double funding any other expenses as they might, remain on the levy or stay with a stormwater utility, for example. And I don't know, Jeff or Lori, if you have any thoughts before we kind of take a quick breather on Q&A.
I would just say that it would be good to include that in your ordinance. If there are specific costs that you are not going to include in your transportation utility, like snow plowing, that you identify that in your ordinance so that if there's a challenge to your transportation utility in the future, that topic doesn't come up. It's already addressed.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm going to kind of go through these here, and then we will have a little bit of time here at the end. This first question is for Jeff. Regarding largest customers, does the trip generation manual take into account the impact of heavier vehicles on the road system?
Two things. I'm going to use that as an excuse to bring up a point I missed earlier as well. While we're looking at the impact on that property, I think it's important to keep in mind the reason those largest properties have the higher charges is they have the greatest number of trips, but the cost per visitor, meaning 2 trips, is a couple of cents typically. So again, you need to break it down to that. With regard to heavy vehicles, there were some communities in existence today that are including a heavy truck factor, we call it, in their charges like that. We're not, it's not from the IT trip generation statistics, however. So the challenge is you need to come up with a reliable, acceptable, consistent way to evaluate heavy truck traffic generated by those properties and then work it into the pricing structure. At one point, originally with the setup with the Village of North Fond du Lac way back in 2003, and Lori and I had the pleasure of working on that. In that model, we did attempt to account for heavy truck and heavy truck trips. But I think it's difficult because you need that very consistent, reliable, objective base information.
One concept that I think about with this topic would be on the sewer side, where, for communities that operate a wastewater treatment facility, in a lot of places where you have industrial usage that is above domestic strength waste, you have a surcharge per pound for that higher strength waste. And I think that concept could be assimilated here to a place where you might have heavy truck traffic that could potentially tear up the road. The second question probably also is something that Jeff may want to talk a little bit about, but how does the density of properties come into play when setting rates? Larger lot sizes involve more roads to connect than smaller lots.
Yeah, that goes back to a couple components to that. That goes back to John's correlation before where he lived close to the wastewater plant and I live far away. It doesn't mean I pay for more sanitary sewer down through the streets and roadways. Same thing applies here. The other is, though, that when you get to density, the trip generation rates have land use types that account for single family homes, multifamily starting off with at least 4 dwelling units in a building, and then moving to another range of properties that are 3 to 10 stories high, again, indicating that tight packed density, and then even greater than 10-story height that have progressively smaller trips per dwelling unit on that, and that recognizes that density factor to that degree. So other than that, again, the whole purpose really when we're assigning these trips is calculating or determining a proportion of trips, the proportion of the total that your property generates on it. So whether you're in a suburban community or an urban community, we're looking again at that proportionate relationship. Hope that makes sense.
It does. Thanks. The last question here before we continue moving forward is, how do you charge other governmental entities such as schools? Are they exempt, or can they be exempt as they were with taxes? I'll maybe address the second point and then turn it over a little bit to Jeff here to talk about the first point. And the second question would be no. They would pay a user charge just as they would for water usage or sewer usage or stormwater for that matter. And that's really important. And I think Lori would agree with this, to differentiate between a fee and a user charge and a tax. So it is important that they do pay based on their proportionate usage.
From the nerdy perspective, in terms of the mechanics of the trip generation assignment, the trip generation data does include good statistical information on average weekday trips for different kinds of schools and school properties, as well as governmental buildings, governmental functions, and all that. So they generate trips when you're designing signalization and traffic signals and studies, so that the data is there, and that's what we use from a technical perspective.
And I would agree from a legal perspective, it is really important to charge tax exempt properties the fees, because that is the distinction between utility fees, which are based on usage, and property taxes, which are not.
Moving on to the next slide here. One question that we've gotten is, what about sidewalks and paths? So I guess the first question is, do we fund them via the utility? So I guess, do we consider them part of the transportation network? And I don't know if Jeff, maybe you want to start with this one, and Lori, if you want to maybe chime in, that would be great.
I'd like to start with it and then have Lori correct me, because from my personal perspective, I've actually had a little interesting conversation last week. But from my personal perspective, I think it's reasonable to expect it's legitimate when the sidewalk is within the street roadway for a construction or a reconstruction. That's part of that system with it. And interesting to note too, that sidewalks are important as a means of protecting pedestrians from moving traffic. It creates that separation on it. I think that if you look at most cities, most communities will take their sidewalk infrastructure and independently, maybe on a 5-year or a 10-year cycle, work through the community and do all the spot panel repairs and replacements because of tree roots and other issues with it. I suspect that's probably getting outside the box, and that might be a little bit more difficult to justify on a generated trips basis on it. And then the third level in my hierarchy, I guess, are those recreational trails and paths that are totally outside the street roadway right away on that. And I have a tough time understanding where that strong correlation fits with those particular properties. Now, one exception that came up in discussion last week was the idea of using an assured objective measure of reductions to a property by moving vehicle trips to bike path type trips. And that's something down the road I think will be interesting to look at as an opportunity.
Yeah, I guess, Lori, maybe could you touch a little bit about the thing that gives me a little bit of pause with this is, if we are taking the transportation system and doing it on the concept of trip generation, and then we throw in walking paths, for example, that might not necessarily line up with a street reconstruction project, that seems to be an area that gives me a little bit of heartburn.
You would have to, I think through and how does it fit with the trips, your trips, vehicle trips? How does the walking paths fit? And I'm not sure what that is. I'm not ready to say that you can't come up with a creative definition, but again, it would be important that if you are going to try to include those type of things, you identify them as part of your transportation system, and then you also indicate how they are tied to the trips. Like Jeff said, with sidewalks, you can have the protection from vehicular traffic. If you can come up with some type of rationale for walking paths, perhaps there would be a way to include it, but you have to think that through and then document it, I think.
Yeah, I think, when you think about water, like a cost of service on the water side, or sewer for that example, for that matter, we're allocating cost to function, but then we're allocating cost to customer class. And I think, when we think about recreational trails or that sort of things, walking paths, maybe there's some thing to think through there from from an allocation standpoint. So, if we move on to the next question, Lori, this one's for you. When we talk about the user fee, how do we distinguish it from a tax?
Well, and this, of course, will be the issue that's raised. As you're looking to put in a transportation utility, people will respond and say, well, this is just a disguised tax, and you're charging me differently than the taxes. And there is, in case law, there is a distinction between utility fees and taxes. And taxes have been defined to be the enforcement of proportional contributions from persons or property imposed by the state or municipality in its governmental capacity for the support of its government, and primary purpose is to obtain revenue for the government. So it really, with the tax, the overarching issue is that it's a general purpose for all purposes. And that's the distinction between a tax and a utility, which is for a segregated enterprise. So it's really important that you have, for this utility, again, that you have a segregated enterprise, and that the fees that are being collected are based upon usage and the services provided by that segregated enterprise, and all the money is kept in there. It is not for the general purpose revenue of the community as a whole. So I think that's really important, but undoubtedly those charges will be made, and you'll have to identify how the fees that are being charged are attributable to this new segregated enterprise. And that's what's really important. And that's why, as we talked about the credits and a variety of different things, it's important that this be tied to use of the transportation system, not just being an alternative funding source that isn't specifically tied to use.
Right. Thanks, Lori. Next question is talking to the public. I mean, certainly this is a new concept. It's not necessarily the easiest to follow when you talk about trip generation and how does that work, and I already pay for this? There's lots of questions that come up during this process. So maybe we could talk just for a few minutes on, and this is probably a question more for Jeff and myself, as we've gone through a couple, workshops and other sorts of public meetings, in terms of really how do we break it down to the public. And I think one of the starting spots, again, is we really, it's about telling the story in terms of, number one, where we are in our road replacement cycle. One of the communities that we worked with, one of the starting spots was recognizing that they were on roughly 150-year replacement cycle for roads, which is woefully behind where anybody should be for road replacement. And that's part of just the restriction of, borrowing restrictions, reliance on grants and other sorts of funds to be able to do it. So I think that's kind of the starting spot. Jeff has done a great job in terms of showing those pie charts that we talked about in terms of the difference between equalized value and number of trips. The other thing I guess I'll mention here when we talk to the public is being very straightforward in terms of the breakdown for your residential property class and what this means, because in a lot of cases, that might be, your winner, winners. When you think about winners and losers here, the residential property class might be one of the winners in terms of changing from a property class method of doing things to a user charge versus some of your non-residential class properties. And I think it's also equally important to hit your bigger customers, head on in terms of what that impact is, and possibly even doing separate education with them, as part of the study process. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add on this concept.
Well, I think we break it down really into kind of 4 steps. That people first need to understand the need, the extent of it as you described, what those needs are, and really translate them to how much money that requires. And then secondly, I think they need to understand the mechanics, the nerdy stuff, enough to be assured that it's fair and equitable for it. Of course, then the obvious next question comes in 2 parts. One is, well, how much is it going to cost me at home? Of course. And the second part of that question is, well, I understand now what it'll cost me at home. How much more is it going to cost me when I'm out in the community visiting and patronizing these other businesses and properties on it? And I think once you've gotten through those 3 first components, then you can start talking about the policy and the values part of it, and maybe move from that point to making a really well-informed value-based judgment.
We've got about 2 questions left, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A again. So this next question really is more just an explanation, but when we talk about the implementation process, I just really wanted to spend a minute on this slide here talking about the process for establishing the utility. And I hope that, one of the takeaways from this session this morning is, that you do spend a good amount of time dealing with the study of this concept and how you're going to go about establishing your user charges, whether that be, trip generation or another method, if that's what you want to go with. But, really looking at what the impact is of the utility for, key parcels, the residential class, your non-residential class, thinking through all of these issues, really, and again, ensuring that you have some differentiation between the user fee and a tax. The other part of this process is the ordinance. And, Lori had talked about a number of concepts that would go into your ordinance in terms of defining what your transportation system is, talking about how the charges are going to be charged to different property owners, whether there be an appeal process and how that's going to work, the governance of this utility, and whether, a credit policy is going to be established. So that's very obviously a necessary step in terms of implementing the utility, but equally important in terms of the study process itself. With that, if you are going to have a credit or an appeal process, making sure that you do think that through, that you do have something spelled out, and that it is as consistent as possible to your other utilities. And then, last but certainly not least, in fact, I would really argue that from a billing standpoint, when you're doing the study process, that whoever within the municipality handles the utility billing, that they be really involved from the ground level, because they're going to be the ones that are going to take this database, this trip generation database, or whatever method you're going to use, and put that into effect. That you really do think about how you're going to be charging these charges. They, in most cases, are going to be, part of the utility bill, but making sure that those folks are involved in the process. So before we leave, I don't know if either one of you have anything to add.
No.
Nope, shaking heads. So we'll go on to the last slide before Q&A. And this is really a question for Jeff, because I think Jeff's done a great job of talking about this in the places where we've been working together. Is how much management is involved with the transportation utility after creation?
I think one of the toughest things about these projects for me as a consultant, I'm sure for you guys as well, is that when we're all done, we're not completing a project and turning it over. What we're really doing is helping you start a program that you end up having to administer. So there's no mincing words on that. And the effort required to administer the program, again, is very much equivalent to that of a stormwater utility. So once it's set up and running, you'll have changes in properties that may require re-evaluation of generated trips to be fair. And a lot of those changes you become aware of either through a building permit that expands the size of a property or its use, or customer changes. A lot of times these are built through either water and sewer or electric utility systems. And in those cases, when there's a change in ownership, a change in property use, there's automatically a built-in trigger system for it. And of course, John mentioned briefly too that you'll likely have occasionally appeals to administer, but on whole, very much like a stormwater utility.
Thanks, Jeff. We've got some time for a few questions here, and a couple that have come in. One question is, how many municipalities are using a transportation utility in Wisconsin? Jeff, maybe you want to talk about this one a little bit?
Those that I'm aware of, now, of course, it's hard to keep track of all of them, but the city of Neenah, I believe the village of Harrison, the village of Kimberly, the town of Buchanan, all up in my neck of the woods, sitting here in downtown Appleton today. The village of Pewaukee, just in the last month or so, has passed an ordinance to implement later this year on that. The city or the village of Weston initiated one in 2015. I believe that terminated after just a year or two. And I think at this point, those are the only communities I'm aware of that have actually put this into operation in Wisconsin.
In addition to that, I know we're aware of a number of communities that are looking at this concept, and it really has become kind of the hot topic of the day. Another question that came in here is, how often would a study need to be updated to continue to be a fair representation of usage? I assume this would vary significantly based on how established a community is. I can maybe start with this one, and my response would be, it's very similar to a water utility or a sewer utility, where you would be establishing a budget on an annual basis, and you would be looking at whether or not you need to make rate adjustments on an annual basis as you go through your budgeting process. Not to say you have to do a full study every year. But certainly, like you would with a water utility or sewer utility, you're doing a periodic review and study update to look at how trip generation has changed. Whether it be maybe a new manual publication, but also just what sort of development trends have you seen in the community? I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything to add on that.
Well, back to the nerdy mechanics a little bit. Presuming that you would be keeping up with new properties that are developed through the other systems we talked about, and also changes to the size and use of existing properties, periodically the Institute of Transportation Engineers does publish a new set of trip generation statistics. The first set I used back in the 2003 era was the sixth generation, the sixth edition rather, and now we're using the 10th edition. So over time, they continue to add data. They continue to add studies. Obviously, as we all go through life, we've seen variations in patterns and changes. And at some point, it would be important to redo the the number of trips generated on that basis too.
Okay. Another question, and this might be one a little more for Lori. Question is, how do you handle special assessments that are already out there?
Well, a utility can generate revenue in a variety of different ways. We already talked about that you can, you can use user fees, but then you can also use general property taxes. You can also use special assessments, but you can't obtain money for the same purpose in multiple ways. So if you're going to obtain money through special assessments, those costs would have to be subtracted from what you're going to obtain fees for. How you would handle, I'm not sure exactly how you would handle it from the perspective of making sure, from a fairness perspective, to make sure that people aren't paying for the same thing twice. But there wouldn't be a problem with having both special assessments and fees. I would just have to think through more, though, how to handle the two properties.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
John, I think there's another aspect to that question, and it might be that if a property's, if an owner's already been assessed by special assessment for an improvement on their street, and the next year, the city puts a transportation utility into effect, they're sitting there with perhaps a few years of special assessment payments to continue making, whereas the construction in that next year is covered by the transportation utility and other people don't pay it. Some of the communities in the state that have gone to vehicle registration fees or wheel taxes have dealt with that already. And from those that I've spoken to, they didn't find a way that Lori would agree is proper and legal. And it ended up that those people that paid the special assessment or started repaying the assessment were stuck.
Another question is there any adjustment made for residents in PUDs where they have to maintain their immediate private streets? They still need to access the public system, yet do have separate maintenance costs similar to on-site stormwater facilities.
That hasn't come up yet, but there is, within the IT statistics, there are formulas that could be applied at that point, where the formula would be applied to calculate trips from that development at its point of access to the public street infrastructure. So I think there's a very well-established and appropriate way to handle that were it to come up in a community we're working with.
I mean, another thing to think about, though, is that typically in the stormwater context, the private stormwater management that a property might do reduces the management that the community has to do. So the credit is that by doing this private project, you're now reducing what the public project that's necessary. I'm not sure whether that same rationale would apply to private streets in a PUD. Again, you'd have to think it through, but I'm not sure that same rationale would carry through.
Okay. One question that sounds like a lot of people want to know is, does a transportation utility have any impact on the expenditure restraint program? And I think it really depends on what sort of costs we're moving from the property tax levy to the user charge. So I think the short answer is it's possible that it might, but it really, I think, depends on whether we're moving operating expenses to the, from the levy to the user charge. So I think, that's something that I'd probably want to give a little bit more thought on. The other item I'll mention before kind of answering one or two more questions is we will get to the questions that we can't fully answer today, that we may run out of time for. We will post an answer in our attendee hub along with a recording of the video for today, and that'll be available for the video itself will be available for the next 90 days. So with that, I think we do have time for one or two more questions here. One question that we've had come up as part of a fair amount of these studies is, obviously we're in hopefully the beginning of the end of a pandemic. But is there any anticipated major changes to the ITE methodologies post-COVID? As more people work from home and delivery services here are possibly modifying or altering our major trip generators. And maybe Jeff, that's something that you could address.
I think two parts to that. One is that in the building that I'm sitting in right now, some of the companies that had, several dozen people are talking about reducing floor space, and that they look at their go forward plan to include fewer full-time people staffing the space. That correlates directly to a reassignment of trips based on the reduced active working area on that. And second, actually 3 parts. Second part of that is, I think a year ago in May, we were looking at an overall 40% or so reduction in trips. That's kind of across the board. And we're looking at the proportionate relationship from property to total on it. And the third is, indeed, over time, as these studies continue and advance, I'm sure that there have been in the past, and there will continue to be some shifting in trip assignments for different types of land uses as those experiences, accumulate data.
Just one final comment here, and then we'll kind of end things. We do have some other questions that we'll get to after the session here, but I do want to remind everybody that there is still time to sign up for next week's session, which is Tools of the Trade, Community Development, Redevelopment, and Housing Authorities. That's next week, Wednesday, March 24th from 11:30 to 1. You can log into the event page for our virtual series to sign up. So before we do end, I really want to thank Jeff and Lori for participating today. I have valued your input immensely over this last year as we've worked together, and I really, really thank you for your participation in today's session. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care and have a great rest of your afternoon.